right, well, good morning, good afternoon. I'd like to welcome everyone to today's webinar in a series of Schneider Electric's virtual perspectives talks for 2020. Today our talk is on moving the green needle in the new normal. We'll be looking at how organizations are navigating both short and long-term challenges of climate leadership during this unprecedented time. I'm joined today by three sustainability leaders that have been gracious enough to share their time and perspectives with us. We'll start with a brief hello and introductions from each of our speakers, starting with you, Jeannie, if you wouldn't mind.
Sure, thanks, Eric. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for the opportunity to join this panel. My name is Jeannie Renee Malone. I'm Vice President of Global Sustainability at VF Corporation. So I lead the global sustainability function, driving the company's environmental strategy, goals and action, reporting, and covering all aspects of our footprint. And on a personal note, I should say, I wear VF products to enjoy the outdoors. For example, my North Face jacket when I'm skiing, Smartwool socks when I'm out hiking, and Vans when I try to ride my skateboard.
Great, thanks, Jeannie. Matt?
Hi, everyone. Thanks for having me, Eric. Pleased to be here and share some of our thoughts. I'm Matt Hamilton. I'm a Director of Corporate Sustainability for VF Corporation. I joined back in June of 2019, and my team and I are focused on reducing the direct environmental impacts of VF's operations globally across 1,700 facilities, focused on climate, energy, wastewater, and green building. I look forward to having a conversation about what the future looks like for us and many of our other companies.
Great. Thanks, Matt. Dean?
Yeah, thanks, Eric, and thanks to you and your colleagues for the invitation to join. Real pleasure to talk with everyone today. So I'm Dean Cambridge, the Deputy Director at We Mean Business Coalition. We're a non-profit coalition, and we work to catalyse business leadership, drive policy ambition, and accelerate the transition to a zero carbon economy. If you're not familiar with us, we are Ceres, BSR, CDP, Climate Group, WBCSD, CLG, and the B team, along with 1,300 businesses that have made bold commitments to climate action. I focus on system strategies in energy, transport, and industry, and support our partners to collaborate on joint or complementary projects that drive ambition, action, and advocacy within business.
All right, thanks a lot, Dean. And I'm Eric Bond, Schneider Electric's Director of Sustainability Services for the Americas region. My team works with VF and many other global corporations to support, advise, and ultimately accelerate their programs on climate and sustainability leadership. So we'll start with a little bit of level setting on why we're here today. We're going to be framing up the challenges and opportunities at hand. Hear a bit from each of our speaking organizations about their programs and backgrounds, and then we'll transition hopefully quickly into some roundtable Q&A with both the VF and the We Mean Business teams. As a reminder, these sessions are recorded. They're intended to be very interactive and to facilitate open dialogues. That's the whole gist of the Perspectives events. So please be prepared to answer several polling questions throughout the presentation today so that we can read the room and kind of gauge where the audience is. But then also we want your questions. I'm really hopeful that none of you leave today's webinar really wishing you'd gotten an answer to a question you'd hope somebody else would ask. Please don't be shy about using the chat window and asking those questions throughout the presentation. My colleagues, Allison and Susanna, are watching the chat log throughout the presentation. We'll be feeding those to us as we go along. So let's begin first with a quick poll, again, in the spirit of reading the room here and figuring out where everyone's coming from. So our first question is going to set the stage of this sort of nexus between sustainability and resiliency. We want to ask about the relative importance of sustainability in the context of business continuity for your organization. So if you wouldn't mind just taking a couple brief moments here and answering sort of along the spectrum of importance where you find your organization today. All right, looks like we've got a decent amount coming in so far. All right, so going to the results so far. No, it's early in the morning for some folks, so maybe quicker on the trigger for the voting on the next one, but for the most part, those responding are pretty decent split here on about a third somewhat important, a little shy of a third on somewhat important and important, but more than a third saying very important. Certainly a few at the tail end of the curve here saying not important at all. So this topic around how sustainability fits in overall business continuity and resiliency is a little bit more about what we're going to be exploring today. So, I probably don't have to tell anyone on the line here, but, we're in fairly unprecedented times at the moment. With the onset of the COVID-19 pandemic, it certainly sent shockwaves across global economies and has really manifested itself into two simultaneous crises for many businesses. We've got clearly a health crisis, a public health emergency, but as well, we're suffering from an economic crisis at the same time. And while these competing challenges have undoubtedly altered the course of 2020, the longer term climate crisis hasn't taken a pause. We've seen a lot of well-intended articles and news stories about historic decreases in air pollution, GHG emissions, the return of wildlife to our streets and our communities, and other natural impacts during this period of the COVID shutdowns. But really, that's clearly demonstrating the coupling that we have between our consumption of resources and emissions and commercial activity and economic outputs. Leading organizations such as the SBTI, CDP, We Mean Business, and others really view this current moment as a crucial inflection point to decouple environmental impacts, to decouple carbon impacts from economic productivity, and to ensure that recovery, in whatever form it takes, whether it's efforts, investments, et cetera, to build back, we'll build back in a more sustainable and resilient way. But in the interim, corporations still have an obligation to report short-term progress and impacts in a transparent and consistent manner. So we'll start off with some perspectives from VF. Let Jeannie tell you a little bit about VF Corp and their commitment to sustainability, and then we'll get into some of the short-term and long-term conversations. Jeannie?
Great, thanks, Eric. So I'll just run through a couple slides here to give you a better understanding of VF and our purpose and commitment to sustainability. So first of all, VF is one of the world's largest apparel, footwear, and accessories companies, connecting people to activities and experiences through a family of iconic outdoor and active brands, including Vans, the North Face, Timberland, Smartwool, and Dickies. You can see a number of those icons up there on the screen. We've been in operation for 20 years and have over 50,000 associates around the world. So next slide. And our commitment to sustainability is truly tied to our business purpose, which is to power movements of sustainable and active lifestyles for the betterment of people and our planet. As a purpose-led company, we have a responsibility to protect natural environments we all share and explore, and to ensure a sustainable future for next generations. And importantly, VF is purpose-led and performance-driven. The better we perform, the more resources we'll have to activate on our purpose, thereby creating value for our stakeholders. And I wanted to mention that inclusion and diversity is key to our purpose. At VF, everyone is welcome. I think it's important to make that statement in today's circumstances. And I've just wanted to note that our CEO has often said that the most creative and innovative ideas come from diverse teams that understand how to effectively leverage individual strengths, perspectives, and experiences of each member to reach a common goal. And finally, our purpose has come to light with our people-first approach to our COVID-19 response, doing all we can to save jobs, including guaranteeing full salaries for North American retail associates, 14-day emergency pay leave for distribution center workers. In terms of PPEs, our Dickies facility, for example, has shifted to produce 3.5 million hospital isolation gowns. And between our brands and the VF Foundation, we've given over $7 million combined to COVID relief efforts supporting businesses and communities. And our brands have donated over $3 million in product donations to frontline workers. So I think that's a really good example of our purpose and people-first approach. So next slide. In 2017, we developed a comprehensive sustainability strategy called Made for Change. And this consists of 3 pillars with a focus on the interconnection between people and the planet. So first, circular business models, which we're building opportunities to lead our industry in the transformation from linear to circular. Scale for good, which is what we are talking about quite a bit today, in which we aspire to leverage our substantial scale to transform the industry in terms of climate change, raw materials, and worker well-being. And then finally, movement makers, where we strive to inspire our thousands of associates and millions of consumers by uniting efforts to create a movement of sustainable and active lifestyles. We've established a number of environmental and social goals with our Made for Change strategy, all which align with the UN Sustainable Development Goals, and I'll speak to a couple of those on the next 2 slides. So next slide. So we are proudly a member of RE100, which, as you all know, is a global leadership initiative led by the world's most influential companies. We're committed to sourcing 100% renewable energy by 2025 in all of our owned and operated facilities. And we're working towards our renewable energy goal through a combination of capital investments and power purchase agreements. And just a shout out to our partner in this effort, Schneider Electric. They're in the process of helping us develop a roadmap of scenarios to meet our goal. We'll speak a little bit more to that later. And Matt is leading that effort for VF, so he'll have some good talking points around that. So next slide. And finally, after a multi-year effort working with the Carbon Trust, Schneider Electric, and others, in December, we announced industry-leading science-based targets to reduce our greenhouse gas emissions across our entire value chain, consistent with the goal of global efforts to limit warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius by 2030. And I don't really need to tell this audience, but they're considered science-based if they're in line with the level of decarbonization required to keep global temperature increase to 1.5 degrees at the maximum and well below 2 degrees Celsius to the minimum compared to pre-industrial temperatures. To get to this point, primary data was collected from over 1,400 owned facilities, distribution centers, and global logistics, as well as more than 100 tier 1 and tier 2 suppliers. All of this strengthens our ability to identify and implement reduction strategies. And you can see our targets up there on the screen. We have a 55% reduction goal of scope 1 and 2 emissions by 2030, and a 30% reduction of scope 3 emissions by 2030 as well. I also want to mention that last year we became a signatory of the UN Fashion Industry Charter on Climate Change, whereas we and others in our industry are committed to carbon neutrality by 2050. And last but not least, we're a proud signatory of We Are Still In. So I will end there.
Awesome, thanks, Jeannie. And now to tell us a little bit about We Mean Business and the Build Back Better campaign, Dean.
Yeah, thanks, Eric. So I'm just going to focus in on the Build Back Better campaign, because that's what we're doing at the moment. But anyone wanting to talk more about We Mean Business and especially science-based targets, RE100, etc., do reach out. And I will say that I can't see the slides, but I know what's on them, so I'm going to fly through. But I'll just shout out to change them when I think when they need to move. So in recent months, we've been sensitively putting out a clear message on the recovery from COVID, and that really is that we can't self-isolate from climate change, and business and government must lay the foundations to build back better from the COVID crisis in order to protect ourselves from future shocks. We must unite behind the science, and Jeannie spoke there about the importance of why we need to use the science, and we must act to halve our emissions by 2030, which is when a lot of the science-based targets lead up to, a 5 to 15 year target, and keep global warming to a maximum of 1.5 degrees. COVID has revealed both our vulnerability to systemic shocks and our ability to act collectively in our shared best interest. So it's vital that we pair the economic recovery with the ambitious climate change action to emerge stronger than before. And business success is going to be synonymous with building back an inclusive economy that delivers decent jobs, the cleaner air, and the safer climate that we need. So that's the short version of the Build Back Better narrative. And we've been activating a range of business and non-profit CEOs that you should be able to see on the screen there. On these messages, we've been elevating their voices more to the media, and we've been doing direct outreach to government leaders in the EU, France, Germany, UK, USA, India, and more. And we've been collaborating with many other organizations and supported hundreds of businesses to call for the economy to be built back better. You can see the Race to Zero there. There's a project with TED on Countdown, and the COP26 that will be happening in November next year, because it's been delayed for a year. Next slide, please. So collectively, we've been urging policymakers to create good jobs, drive economic recovery, whilst reducing emissions and building resilience. But we hear more and more from policymakers that they get the overarching narrative, they understand what we've been saying, but they need the exact detail. So that's why we've been working with lots of businesses to specify those exact actions that business needs from government on clean power, mobility, buildings, and industry to be able to move faster in what we need. Next slide, please. And on top of that, we've also suggested a number of conditions on corporates receiving financial assistance. And these are all things that should be baked into a good sustainability strategy that we'll be talking about today, I'm sure. So business needs to integrate risk into disclosure, needs to use science to inform the strategy, and needs to invest in a low carbon future. So Build Back Better is going to be the focus of our work globally for many months to come, as it will be for all the organizations that we work with. We've got a dedicated section on our website, many more resources for those that want to dig deeper. We can also point towards what each of our partners are doing, lots of research and analysis going on as well to make sure we're fit and understand where we need to go in the future. Thanks.
Right, so that sets us up then for our first of our sort of roundtable discussions here. Thanks, Dean, and thanks, Jeannie, as well, for giving some of the perspectives and insights from your organization. Helps level set a bit here. Before we dive into some of the content and discussion on the short-term strategy, I'm curious for those of you in the audience, if you wouldn't mind to please answer this poll here. We're really seeking to understand, how has your sustainability program been impacted in the short term? Maybe that's just impacts to your near-term reporting. Maybe you're grateful for the extra months for groups like CDP or others. Maybe you're evaluating, though, also impacts to goals and targets that you may have set either 2020 or even further out. So if you wouldn't mind to just please log your poll and check the group. Right, we'll see some responses coming in, but it looks like we've got the bulk of them in. So taking a look at the results here, by and large, it looks like roughly half of the organizations on the line today. And just, for clarity, there's about 200 of you out there. So thanks for the participation. But about half of you are saying it's too early to tell at this point, while the rest is somewhat split between no impacts and either impacts to near-term reporting or reporting and to goals. I'm curious, Jeannie, Matt, I know we'll get into more details about some of the tactical implications, but just if you were, presented with this poll, how would you answer this for VF today?
So I'll start, and then Matt, if you'd like to chime in, that would be great. I would say that for us, COVID really has not slowed down our commitment. In fact, we are probably putting more emphasis on it now. I think it's we're leaning in on our sustainability efforts now, and COVID gave us a really unique opportunity to see how resilient our Earth is when given the time and space to heal and recover. And so I think we're really thinking through consumer expectations of what companies are going to be doing coming out of the crisis. I think it's really increased the awareness between health and climate, and so it really gives us an opportunity to lean in. So this has really unchanged our commitment, and in fact has probably allowed us to lean in even more. And one more comment, I'll just see if Matt has anything to add, that we're seeing people really want to connect more with the outdoors. And so there's a really important connection for companies like ours, especially being an outdoor active brand company, that we have a responsibility and an opportunity to protect the environment and to really help our consumers understand that connection between health, environment, and our brands.
Great.
I guess the only thing I'd add, Eric, and building off of some of what Dean had to say too, in fact, Jeannie and I are both participating in some virtual advocacy days as we speak. I think the short-term implications are there are real opportunities in the advocacy space today to talk about critical issues like the ITC and PTC extension. Obviously, that is driven by impacts on supply chains in the renewable space. But I am seeing for the first time in my 10 plus years of doing this work in Capitol Hill, much more openness to those sorts of conversations than I have previously seen. And so while obviously COVID has had tremendous impacts on our families and our businesses and our friends, and some of us have lost loved ones, it has also, I think, provided a window to have conversations and to maybe bring divergent voices together to think about how do we address the challenges that we face economically in this country and globally to really set ourselves up to be better positioned should we face, which we will, face these sorts of challenges, whether it's climate change or unfortunately another pandemic like this in the future.
Got it. Thanks. No, those are both really, I think, insightful perspectives on how you guys are seeing it impact. I think particularly you said, kind of the opportunity to elevate these topics, whether it's tax credits or the investment climate and things like that, using this as a launching off points key. I'm somewhat conscious of the fact that I know a lot of folks on the phone. I'm sure you guys feel it as well. Right in the midst of a very busy reporting season, in the sort of sustainability calendar of the year. Each year we're looking back on the prior year's performance. And so most of us right now are still in the middle of looking at 2019. But as I'm having conversations with other customers, with folks out there in the industry, they're already looking at 2020. They're looking at the impacts of March. They're looking at, what shutdowns through the spring have meant for them and what it might mean some of their shorter term trending, whether it's energy and greenhouse gas trending, whether maybe they've got a goal that's normalized to revenue or to some amount of production. And so they're worried about what that might mean. Are you guys experiencing any sort of short-term sort of reporting anxiety or uncertainty about what 2020 might bring in light of operational changes that you felt as a business?
Go ahead, Jeannie.
No, go ahead, Matt. I was just laughing.
I'm only smiling because Eric, part of me wants to flip this back to you and say, is your team who helps us prepare for all of that reporting experiencing any anxiety? I would say for us, our goals, first of all, are longer term. They're 2025, they're 2030, they're 2050. The goal, the end zone hasn't moved. The goal hasn't changed for us. I see 2020. I think we see 2020 as an aberration, and I think the critical component to that is transparency that comes along with that. I don't know, Jeannie, if you want to add any more to that.
No, I think that's exactly right. I mean, to your first point, Eric, we always appreciate a little bit extra time in our reporting cycle, so we'll take it. And thanks CDP and others for setting the deadline. I'm sure you agree too, since you help us out with that. So, but no, I think we have long-term goals, and I think it will be really interesting to see how companies report during this period of time, and there will be a decrease in emissions because we shut down our retail stores and shut down a lot of our DCs for a while, and factories were shut down for months. So I think it'll be really interesting. I really hope that out of this we see a real dedicated change to looking for continued opportunities to minimize emissions. And Matt spoke to this so well. It's really an opportunity to increase our advocacy during this time to help our lawmakers or policymakers understand a more resilient and climate resilient recovery.
Absolutely, absolutely. Dean, maybe a question for We Mean Business. You mentioned earlier the 1 year postponement of the COP conference, and just in terms of what you're seeing from a sort of public policy perspective and international governments and their view on this topic right now, is there a sense that there are bigger fish to fry right now, or that we're solving different issues and it's just not as vitally important this year, and that leads to some of the delay? Or is this truly just a matter of prudence around travel and ability to bring groups together, but it's still top of mind for folks?
Yeah, I think it's definitely still top of mind, and an awakening, a greater recognition of how these issues are intertwined and building in resilience. The delay of COP was a long decision to be made, and thoughts of whether it would come in early next year, summer next year, or towards the end of next year, and making sure that it's still going to be as productive a meeting as we'd like to see. And hey, it gives the rest of the world, the non-state actors, a chance to really build up what we're doing and take that message to government. In terms of the real action that we're seeing, are pushing for climate change to be recognised and included in stimulus. And Matt, you were mentioning some of the actions that are being taken in the US. Lead on Climate has seen 300 businesses calling from the US Congress to pass resilient economic plans. We've had 200 companies in the UK. There's a big statement coming from those in Japan. In the European Commission, their Green Deal budget recovery has about 25% of it allocated to low carbon tech, to vehicles, to building retrofits. So the message is breaking through. And we had on June 5th, I think that really ties together how non-state actors are coming together on this. On World Environment Day, there was a collective action of business, and this was a campaign launched by COP26, the UK government, and the Climate Champions team, Gonzalo Munez and Nigel Topping, of a Race to Zero, a global campaign of climate leadership that's about healthy, resilient, zero carbon recovery. That's from its start date, that's got almost 450 cities, 21 regions, about 1,000 businesses, 38 investors, over 500 universities, and that's just the start. So where net zero was kind of barely a mainstream consideration a few years ago, it's recognised, I think, by many governments as our only future now.
Eric, if I can add real quick, I do think something that really has, I think if you can find a positive in all of what's gone on, I think what we've seen in the past, 4, 8, 12, 16 weeks is how intertwined, and we all know this, but I think it's made it evident how intertwined the issues of health and equity and sustainability are. And I think for those of us who strive, whose daily jobs are focused on sustainability, that's ultimately what is going to make our work successful. To continue to deal with climate in a box separate from those issues is really not building a strong foundation for the kind of success I think we all want to leave for our kids and our grandkids and future generations. And so I think if anything, what we're seeing, and Dean sort of highlighted that, and Jeannie and I have had many conversations about that, is the importance of making those connections within VF, within the apparel sector and broadly across business, because unfortunately our governments aren't doing it.
Right. Great. Thanks for that additional context, Matt. I don't want the point to be lost as well, and Jeannie made this early on in her response there around sort of the importance of consistency and transparency in reporting. So while focusing on these new topics and new opportunities, keeping a steady hand on the wheel in terms of your disclosures, reporting out progress against existing goals, et cetera. We've had a number of conversations with CDP, WRI, and other groups on the importance of making sure that for those of you who have been reporting out progress on goals, who are reporting out, either absolute or intensity normalized performance, you continue to do so. For those of you with short-term targets, maybe expiring in 2020, perhaps your gold medal as you cross the finish line has a bit of an asterisk on it. That's okay. It's better to be consistent and transparent and sort of work the plan that you've made for yourself than to use this as an excuse to sort of pull away from your traditional reporting and confuse the audience. So with that, we may shift into some of the more longer term topics here. We're trending pretty well from a timing perspective on the content. Again, I wholeheartedly encourage those of you to continue feeding questions into the chat window or the questions box. But looking at long term, we're going to start off with a poll just like we did on the last. And this one's going to be a bit simpler. So in terms of your options here, what impacts do you anticipate to longer term strategy, goals, and reporting as a result of current disruptions? Two choices here, little or no impact or significant impact. Imagine this might go quite a bit quicker. And Jeannie, Matt, maybe while folks are filling this in, if I could put you on the spot to give an answer for this as well, I'd love to hear just your brief perspective on this question, how you'd answer.
Jeannie, actually, as I was reading the question, and you mentioned a bit in your earlier, but I wonder if you want to chat a bit more about what we're seeing and what we're thinking about from a consumer expectation perspective, because I think when I read this question, I think a lot of what we're seeing is heightened consumer expectation for how companies live their purpose and how they really behave, how they take a stand, how they really bring their values to life through the decisions they make about renewable energy sourcing, et cetera. Jeannie, do you want to add to that a little bit? I think you've been doing a lot of thinking about that.
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Matt. And actually, I think I'll talk about it from both a consumer and an investor perspective. So as we discussed earlier, we don't really anticipate impacts for a long-term strategy because we are fully committed as a company that sustainability is tied to our business purpose. And in fact, this just puts heightened awareness around our need to address climate change and to be more vocal from a policy perspective and advocacy perspective. And also to Matt's earlier point, to really think about the intersection of equity, climate change, and health that we're seeing right now. And so we're in a really unique time to think about our long-term strategy and how to incorporate some of these immediate issues that we're seeing around the world. But from a consumer perspective, we anticipate, and we're already seeing trends of companies that are likely going to preference companies that really are true to their purpose. So what we're doing around the world to, with our people first approach to COVID we've seen a really positive response. Vans, for example, is donating a portion of sales to help small skate shops that have been closed and impacted by COVID. And there's been a real, positive kind of feedback from consumers with that. So, and that's short term, but that really feeds into our long-term strategy of engaging with our consumers from both a social and environmental perspective of what we're really trying to accomplish. And I think as more consumers become aware of where products come from, who's putting your products together, where raw materials are coming from. So for example, we're putting a lot of thought into, we have a long-term strategy around sustainable materials, knowing that nearly half of our impacts comes from the extraction, production, and manufacturing of raw materials. We want to go back to the farmers and help with regenerative practices, which help not only reduce our carbon impacts, but there's also a local positive benefit to those ranches and farms that benefit the people working on the farms from a health and environmental perspective, but also an economic diversity perspective. So our long-term strategies are really, we're thinking about consumers and how we can advance what we're doing from a sustainability perspective now, long-term, to communicate those benefits and impacts to consumers. And then finally, I'll just add that from an investor perspective, we're already seeing positive feedback from investors that are recognizing that we are continuing to focus on ESG. And so everything I mentioned around from our social perspective and people first approach to our COVID response has been seen in a positive light from the ESG investment community. And adds to, we issued a green bond in February. We're the first apparel and footwear company to issue a green bond. And it was very successful from a combination of factors, that we have a strong balance sheet and a good credit rating, and then a very solid sustainability story. But it gave us an opportunity to tell our story to the investor community, and it was received very positively. And so I think for those others out there that are thinking about this, it's important to stay the course. It's not only important to from an equity perspective, thinking about environmental equity and social equity, but also from a financial stability to companies that are truly focused on this and continue to engage with consumers and investors.
Awesome. Thanks so much for that perspective, Jeannie. As I look at the the poll results that we got back here, we've got a pretty even split between little or no impact. And maybe those are folks who either haven't yet or seen some of the impacts, maybe that they were in the wait or see or too early to tell answer group on the prior poll, or maybe it's folks who, as you mentioned, are just finding value in staying the course here, that this may be a bit of an aberration or a blip on the radar, but ultimately over a 5, 10, 15-year type of time horizon, these things smooth out, and it's important to stay the course. For those of you seeing significant impact, I can certainly appreciate that as well. Jeannie, some of what you touched on goes to what I'm seeing a couple questions come in through the question panel here, and that's around engaging your value chain at this time. You talked about how you're working, downstream with consumers and with local skate shops and being there for economic support, but at the same time using that to build those relationships for collaboration. Then I think about upstream and some of your, your purchase goods and materials, the raw inputs that go into your product. Do you find that you're able to get the same degree of airtime and collaboration and conversation today in the midst of everything that we're going through with some of those, agricultural, farmers and sowers and cutters, and, folks upwards in your value chain, or is it, is it a mixed bag at this point?
It's I'll start with this one, Matt, if you want to add in. I hate to give this, but it's really, it depends. Across our, many of our factories have been closed for a while, and they're not our factories, but our leased factories. And so they're just starting to open again, and they've actually been super responsive in submitting data that we collect through, the Sustainable Apparel Coalition has a suite of tools, one of them being a module to collect environmental data. And over 50% of our factories have already submitted data, even given the circumstances right now. So there's a continued interest to engage with us on, on what we've been doing on a long-term basis. In terms of engaging with farmers, yeah, there's a lot of interest, and we're talking with some farmers in New Zealand, for example, about regenerative practices, and we're exploring a few pilots around the world to really help advance and lead in this area. And the response has been super positive. I think there is an interest to really think about environmental improvements during this time. So it's not, I wouldn't say the response is immediate every single time, but the
Sure.
interest is absolutely there.
Great. Dean, I'm curious from your perspective as well, in your interaction with other leading organizations, what are the tangible steps that you see folks taking now to ensure that as they reopen or as they reemerge into the economy, that they're sort of accounting for these more structural or longer term approaches to resiliency and decoupling carbon?
Yeah, and to your earlier comment, Eric, about the downtick that we've seen in emissions, and it just really highlights the task ahead, and not to put a downer on anything, right? But 3 billion odd people on lockdown, the projection is a 5.5% fall in emissions this year. But if we want to be on a 1.5 degree trajectory, we need closer to 8%. And we're not going to ask sort of 6 billion people to be on lockdown every year. And the businesses that we work with day to day know that the actions they take now, stakeholders in the future are going to be looking back at how they responded to these, what internal decisions were made, and managing, you pointed out how companies were involved in those external decisions as well. And the partners that we work with have been talking a lot about materiality and stakeholder assessments needing to be reconsidered, re-examining the issues that are important, who they're important to, and recognizing integrated capitals are at the heart of good governance. And to build that resilience, and much that we do in the terms of systems thinking, and Ginny was talking there about the collaboration across the value chain, scanning horizons, planning for all scenarios, recognizing that companies exist in this vulnerable and interdependent system and need to understand the short-term risks and engage across those value chains. Actually, the TCFD have about a 40-page supplement guide for businesses on scenario analysis, and that should be part of companies reporting as well, to show how they built this into their strategic plans and are ready for those future shocks. Collaborating with those in the system is key. We call them internally action collaboratives, but these are about industrial hubs coming together, sector coupling, integrated renewables approaches, and sort of many of you may already be part of REBA or the Mission Possible platform. A key piece of collaboration we've seen last month was Ørsted announcing the Large Green Hydrogen project, where they're going to bring together emission-free fuels for sustainable ships, trucks, aircraft, and heavy industry. And these are the key type of projects that we want to see. And there's a key role for leading businesses to support, engage, educate those across the supply chain as well. And recently there was a SME route for science-based targets launched, and we're seeing that as a key opportunity for leading businesses to engage and just have a resilient strategy now that's set up for the future.
Great. Thanks for that, Dean. You mentioned a bit of reliance upon, sort of collective action, industry working groups, even things like, manufacturing hubs and things of that nature. I'm wondering if you're seeing a bit of a difference in response or urgency around this topic from a geographical perspective as well. We got a question that came in through the chat, specifically seeing, any more acute impacts, for instance, for Asia versus Europe or North America, as we're seeing this crisis sort of spread in a staggered way across the globe. Any collaborative action at more of a geographical level?
Yeah, there is, and this was going on before, right? So especially for our partner, World Business Council, they have a distributed network of organizations working in key regions, and part of our one of the key projects on energy productivity through the climate group is about bringing these working groups together in Africa, across Asia, and particular projects in India on renewable energy, and China on advancing corporate sourcing there. Now, they have been massively impacted because everything had to move virtually, but that has been sort of consistent across the globe. And it was a bit of a struggle at first to find new ways to do that, making sure everyone was able to join, but they're moving forward. What we have seen is the importance for EU, US businesses and business-facing organizations, think tanks, to take that knowledge, research, and apply it into context in other countries and support the work they're doing there.
Great, thanks for that. Matt, if I might pick on you for a moment here, given some of your experience both on sort of the policy and advocacy area, as well as, sort of tactically, you're working in the energy markets a bit as well. One of the questions we've been hearing a lot of is really, how the economic downturn that's coming alongside of, this health crisis is impacting things like availability of access to capital, or, credit worthiness of, project partners, even things like, the deal cycle of getting a contract done, in some large scale procurement initiatives. Has it impacted at all sort of your trajectory and pace within VF for, achieving your RE100 goals, or is it sort of business as usual, but just virtually?
It's a bit of both. We've actually had some firsthand experience with some force majeure clauses being exercised, affecting COD dates, for instance, on a deal, and so we've seen it firsthand in that regard, right up front. And then I think on the other side of the coin, what we've seen because of sort of ambiguity in the U.S. market and other places around stability of renewable energy incentives is a real jumpstart, and part of it has to do with Jeannie and I have been with VF for just about a year, both of us, and our RE100 2025 goal being 5 years away, 4 years away, I guess, depending on how you want to count it, is a desire to really kind of move quickly, particularly in the U.S. market, not knowing what those what the regulatory market's going to look like in the future. We've been working with your team, or are beginning to work with your team on that. And so it's a bit of both, but I think we're certainly seeing the economic downturn having an influence, and it also has an influence in terms of how we think about how it is we're going to achieve our goals and how we prioritize. Certainly in the short term, this fiscal year versus future fiscal years. We, like every company, we're fortunate to be in the position we're in, but we, like all of us at home, have to watch our budgets, right? And so that forces us to prioritize where we make investments. And so maybe some of the bigger investments we might have been dreaming about in December are now sort of more distant dreams for a future fiscal year.
Gotcha. No, thank you. I appreciate the candidness and transparency of that feedback. I know that that's it's a tough question for all of us to be wrestling with right now. I'm curious as well. Maybe this is for all three of you, whichever might have some context on it, but we received some questions in advance of this topic or this webinar asking, we're seeing at the same time some historical low prices in the energy market, particularly here in North America. We've got oil price wars erupting. We've got natural gas and electric power prices falling because of reduced industrial demand and commercial demand. That's at one hand perhaps opportunistic for folks and helps out the budget, but on the other hand, there's concerns that it might disincentivize some of those projects or some of those payback hurdles that you may have had for some of those more pie in the sky projects you're alluding to. What sort of word track or approach do you use with your executives to keep focus on investment when cheap natural gas or cheap oil, cheap electricity is maybe suppressing some urgency around that?
I guess I'll start, and then Gene, maybe you want to jump in a bit here. But I think you don't have to look any farther than BP and Shell making net zero and commitments and eliminating greenhouse gas emissions by 2050 to say that the energy companies they see the writing on the wall in the long term. I think it's a long-term game. Yeah, we're seeing some short-term price fluctuation, but I think even your teams at Schneider would tell us that long term renewables are still winning the day on a price basis. And so I think the table is sort of set, and what we as responsible businesses have to really do is to think about, from an equity standpoint and from a health standpoint, how do we support just transitions for those communities of workers, because there's a massive economic and job shift going on globally that if we are not responsible as businesses, we risk creating greater economic divides within society, and that has an adverse impact upon our ability to achieve our broader sustainability goals. So I don't know, Jeannie or Dean, if you want to add to that.
Yeah, I'll just add one comment to that, and that go back to what we were talking about earlier, is that we are committed to our long-term goals, and our leadership is committed to those, and we'll prioritize investments based on the highest return or the biggest opportunity for each of those. And so we balance that return with opportunity based on how that gets us to our long-term goals, and what is the best return for the company overall.
Gotcha.
Yeah, I'm really echoing that. I mean, the volatility of the prices should be a key reason for executives not to take any short-term risks, right, and to build resilience by adopting renewables. There's going to be some really interesting, important analysis coming from the Energy Transition Commission, and probably in a few weeks' time. And if anyone is familiar with their previous reports, is about changing the narrative, defining what is possible in the future. So we're going to expect by 2050 electricity demand is going to increase 5-fold, and there are major opportunities to couple sectors, integrate renewables, and it's all about balancing that energy system, right, and how we're mixing the use of those different inputs. Solar and wind and sure that any balances
Dean, I think we may have lost a little bit of your audio there at the end of that statement. I don't know if the rest of the presenters heard the same.
Likely,
Yeah.
it's a bit shock side. We got finished off with gas with effective removals and looking more at green gas such as hydrogen. So keep an eye out for the analysis.
Well, that's perhaps a good tee up then for some of the more transformative technologies and more stepwise changes. We got a bit of I'll call it a little bit of a provocative question in the Q&A that a lot of what we're talking about so far seems somewhat incremental. Seems like perhaps an acceleration, but of a linear curve around a transition to a clean carbon economy. So I'm wondering what, from your organizations, whether it's We Mean Business and some of the more transitional technologies and things that you see advocacy around, or even VF, single steps that you're taking, what are those more stepwise changes that you still look forward to over that longer term horizon? What are the things that you're putting in place today that are going to help decouple your future economic growth from carbon growth?
Well, I think one of those is really the rise of digitalization in terms of how we produce product and produce samples, and how we do all of that work that leads up to the shoe landing on your foot or the jacket on your back. How can we do that without having to rely on air freight, for instance, to get the physical product back and forth? How do we reinvent our distribution centers? And we're certainly seeing, as is everyone, a rise in e-com. And how do we do that and think about the waste that's produced there? And then some of the more cutting edge things that I've been thinking about that I actually was just on a Reba call a few days ago, and I hadn't thought much about it. Maybe you have, Eric and Dean and Jeannie. But the rise of battery storage to replace peaker plants, for instance, is an interesting concept. One that I wasn't familiar with before. So I think that's some of the other things more broadly in the market. And then lastly, I think what COVID has highlighted for us is our reliance on our supply chains. And so there's a tremendous amount of opportunity. I won't say I know the answers. Dean referenced a few of those to think about the footprint of our logistics operations. And for our brands that are ultimately making decisions about how a product arrives to your door, to think about the impact of those decisions from a CO2 standpoint and not simply a speed perspective. And so that's an area I'll tell you we don't have an answer to, but it's a conversation that Jeannie and myself and others are actively engaged in working towards.
Gotcha. Great. I know Dean had to drop offline and is connecting back in due to a connection issue. So maybe a question back to VF as we move into the more of the audience Q&A here before we wrap up. One of the questions came from actually another retailer, and they said that they had done a greenhouse gas inventory inclusive of their comprehensive scope 3 and found that 98% of their inventory was in their value chain, was not their scope 1 and 2, their direct operations. What messaging would you have for them around how relevant and impactful their own actions are versus just going all in on supplier engagement, value chain reductions? How do you balance the need to lead with the need to collaborate?
Jeannie, do you want to take that?
Sure. Yeah, it's a great question because we are in the similar situation, and it's probably same for brands in our industry, that nearly 99% of our impacts are in our scope 3 and across our supply chain, and particularly in our raw materials, as I was saying earlier. But that doesn't take away from a company commitment perspective, what we want to do around scope 1 and 2. I mean, we want to create a healthy, productive environment for our own employees. And so when we put investments into LEED certified buildings, we're exploring well and Fitwell right now, especially in a time where there's so much focus on health and well-being. That's important. We care about our own people and those commitments, that even though it's only 1% of our impacts, we need to continue to put that emphasis on our own direct operations. And I think there's also a consumer perspective that understands when companies walk the talk, to say it very simply, that they're really, they really care about what their commitments mean from a broader spectrum. So there's no we wouldn't de-emphasize our scope 1 and 2 and our commitments around those, because we know how important that is to our own employees and to those working within our built environment.
And Eric, the only other thing I'd add is I think there's an opportunity whether it's our brands or our competitors' brands, to leverage that voice to both educate consumers, but to also educate and support our supply chain. I think more importantly, support our supply chain. It's incumbent upon us, and my colleague Joyce Choi in Hong Kong is really doing really phenomenal work in this area to work with our suppliers who do depend on our business to support and provide advice, connect them with financial resources, connect them with partners to influence that scope 3 emissions. And if we're not engaged in that work in a scope 1 and scope 2 perspective, we don't really have a foundation in scope 3.
Right. Great, thanks for that additional commentary. Dean, I know you're back with us, at least hopefully via audio. Anything that you would add around leveraging this inflection point as a way of accelerating reductions across supply chains or value chains? We may not have him. All right. Well, I've gone through the questions here on the window. Allison, Susanna, I don't know if we have any additional ones that we want to try and cover before we close out. All right. Well, then we may just transition then to some key takeaways and close this out on time. So I'm not going to belabor here or attempt to read the whole slide. I want to first, thank everyone for a compelling discussion, especially the participants asking questions, but especially to VF and Dean from We Mean Business for sharing your perspectives on our path forward. Some key takeaways related to both the short and the long term are captured on the screen here. I think what I would stress is that for those of you who are sustainability professionals on the line, that you view this period not only as an obligation to continue the conversation around climate change and to continue reporting transparently and consistently, but also to use this time as a way of expanding the conversation. I think Matt and Jeannie both did a great job of talking about how bringing wellness, how bringing people and bringing purpose to what a broader topic of resilience means, with climate as a component or as a core, is really key for us in this time. And then, of course, want to thank Dean for the perspective he brings from We Mean Business around a longer view and how global collaboration, public policy, business action, et cetera, can help pave the way for a more sustainable and resilient future. So again, thanks to all the speakers for the conversation today. Jeannie, Matt, Dean, any last parting shots from the three of you that you might want to add before we close out?
I'll just say, Eric, thanks so much for your partnership and for all the great work that you do and for leading this conversation. It's been terrific and really appreciate the time.
Fantastic.
Yeah, thanks for having us, Eric.
All right, thank you guys, and thank you to Dean as well. Allison, I think we've got one more slide here. So as a last parting shot, just a reminder that this is one of a series of Perspectives virtual webinars. Our next one is on the 25th of June, covering what 2020 and beyond holds for energy and sustainability. So if you haven't yet registered, please feel free to hit the link in the feedback emails. This recording, the questions, and the materials will be shared out to all of those who registered and are in attendance on the call. With that, I'll thank the speakers once more and wish you all a great day.
Thanks.
Thanks.